The USS Enterprise D had survived the Borg. It had survived Q. It had survived temporal anomalies, rogue holograms, and Lieutenant Barclay. It had survived, on one memorable occasion, being briefly transformed into a sailing vessel by an omnipotent child. The ship and her crew had faced the impossible so many times that Commander Data had quietly recalibrated the bridge's definition of nominal to include events that would have caused lesser crews to collectively resign. None of that prepared them for Duke Nukem. It began, as so many Enterprise crises did, without warning. One moment the bridge was humming with the quiet efficiency of a Tuesday in deep space. Ensign Rowe at navigation, Data at ops. Counselor Troy attempting to read the emotional resonance of a passing nebula. Picard halfway through a cup of Earl Grey and a report on Cardassian border movements. The view screen showed stars. Normal stars. Beautifully, uneventfully normal stars. Then the rift opened. It materialized at approximately the center of the bridge, a jagged tear in space-time roughly 2 meters tall, crackling with energy signatures that Data would later describe as unlike anything in Federation records, though bearing superficial resemblance to both Iconian gateway technology and a type of dimensional scarring consistent with repeated high-yield explosive detonations across multiple realities. It smelled, somehow, of gunpowder and something aggressively synthetic that Troy would later identify, with profound confusion, as the emotional resonance of absolute self-confidence. Through it came Duke Nukem, moving at a dead sprint, firing 2 pistols backward over his shoulder at something that did not follow him through. He cleared the rift, planted both boots on the carpet of the Enterprise bridge, watched the tear collapse behind him with a sound like reality clearing its throat, and then swept his gaze across the bridge with the calm, assessing expression of a man who had walked into unexpected rooms for a living. He was enormous. That was the first thing the bridge crew registered. Not just tall, architecturally large, built along lines that suggested someone had looked at a normal human being and decided to add roughly 40% more of everything. The white tank top, the biceps that appeared to have their own gravitational field, the jaw, which could have been used to break rocks in an emergency, the sunglasses worn indoors, in space, without apparent irony. He looked at Picard. Picard looked at him over the rim of his Earl Grey. Duke looked around the bridge, the curved consoles, the view screen full of stars, the crew staring at him with expressions ranging from alarm to professional fascination, and arrived at a verdict with the speed of a man who had never once in his life been plagued by self-doubt. Said Duke Nukem. Nice ship. He holstered both pistols. Picard set down his tea. In his 30-plus years of Starfleet service, Jean-Luc Picard had developed what his crew privately called the voice, a tone of such measured, resonant authority that it had successfully de-escalated Klingon war parties, caused Romulans to reconsider long-held strategic positions, and once convinced Q to leave the ship for nearly 6 weeks. He deployed it now with the precision of a man who understood that the next 30 seconds would set the tone for everything that followed. I am Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the USS Enterprise. You are aboard a vessel of the United Federation of Planets. A pause, calibrated perfectly. Who are you, and where did you come from? The large man in the sunglasses looked at him for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth pulled into something that was technically a smile but carried the energy of a challenge. The name's Duke, he said. Duke Nukem. I'm the guy who saves the world. He glanced around the bridge again, taking in the clean lines, the beeping consoles, the distinct absence of alien gore or smoking craters. Looks like I'm a little early. At tactical, Lieutenant Worf had risen approximately 2 inches taller than his already considerable height, one hand resting on his console with the controlled stillness of a man who was professionally curious about whether his phaser was going to be relevant in the next 30 seconds. At Ops, Data had already begun, running 17 simultaneous analyses on the dimensional rift residue, the visitor's biometrics, the energy signature of the weapons now holstered at his hips, and what appeared to be trace particle evidence of at least 11 distinct alien species, biological matter on his boots, none of them from this galaxy. Counselor Troy, whose empathic senses were designed to read emotional states, had gone very slightly pale. She would describe it later, in her log, as like standing next to a very large Speaker playing one note, extremely loudly. That note being confidence. Picard stepped down from his chair, with the deliberate calm of a man who understood that the universe occasionally deposited impossible things on his bridge, and that the correct response was never to flinch. Mr. Nukem, he said, and the name cost him something, though his expression revealed nothing. I'll need you to surrender your weapons and accompany me to a briefing room, where we can discuss your situation in a civilized pass, said Duke. A beat of silence. I beg your pardon. The weapons stay. Duke rolled one massive shoulder in something, approximating a shrug. I go anywhere without hardware. Something tries to eat me. That's not a theory. That's Tuesday. Behind Picard, Riker had appeared from his seat, arms folded, wearing the expression he reserved for situations he privately found more interesting than he was professionally allowed to admit. He caught the captain's eye and offered the microscopic eyebrow raise that meant, this one's different. Picard clasped his hands behind his back. This was, his crew knew, the gesture that preceded either a diplomatic masterstroke or a very long conversation. He looked at Duke Nukem, this impossible, sunglasses-wearing, gunpowder-scented man who had fallen out of a dimensional rift onto the carpet of the finest ship in Starfleet, and made his first command decision regarding him. Very well, said Picard. Keep the weapons, but you will come with me to the briefing room. A pause, and we will talk. Duke Nukem looked at the captain for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised every person on the bridge. He nodded. A short, simple nod, carrying a fraction of genuine respect, the acknowledgement of one man who had looked impossible things in the eye and kept walking for another. Lead the way, Professor, he said. If you want to see more characters crash into different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. Picard turned toward the briefing room. Duke fell into step behind him, boots heavy on the carpet, sunglasses catching the bridge lighting. Data watched them go and opened a new analytical file, labeling it simply, Nukem, Duke, ongoing. Worf stared at the doors long after they closed. I do not like him, he announced to no one in particular. Riker smiled into his console. Give it time, Mr. Worf. The Federation briefing room was designed for civilized discourse. This was evident in everything about it. The long, polished table that reflected the star field beyond the windows. The ergonomic chairs positioned at thoughtful intervals. The soft lighting calibrated to promote calm and rational exchange. The small replicator in the corner ready to produce beverages appropriate to diplomatic tension. It had hosted negotiations between species that had been at war for centuries. It had witnessed treaties signed and alliances forged. It was, in every architectural detail, a room that believed in the power of words. Duke Nukem sat in one of the chairs, with the posture of a man who had, never once in his life, found a seat uncomfortable, leaned back until the chair protested slightly, and put one boot on the edge of the table. Picard sat across from him and did not acknowledge the boot. This was a conscious choice. Riker sat to Picard's left, notepad in hand, projecting the mild attentiveness of a first officer who was gathering data while also, privately, finding this tremendously entertaining. Troy sat beside Riker, hands folded, watching Duke with the careful focus of someone trying to read a book written in a language they almost recognized. Data sat at the far end of the table with a pad, recording everything. Tell me about yourself, Picard began. The classic opening. Neutral, open, inviting. It had worked on Klingon generals and Romulan admirals and one extremely confused time traveler from the 13th century. Duke regarded him from behind the sunglasses. Spent the last 15 years killing aliens that tried to take over Earth. Save the world. More than once. He paused. You're welcome. You're from Earth, Riker said. Which century? 21st. Give or take. Duke glanced at the view screen on the briefing room wall, currently displaying a star chart of their current sector. You're further out than that. 24th century, Data supplied. Stardate. So humanity made it, Duke said. It wasn't quite a question and wasn't quite a statement. Something in the middle. A man running a quick calculation and approving of the result. He looked around the room again, reassessing. Cleaner than I expected. We've had time to improve, Picard said, with the precise warmth of a man who genuinely meant it, and also understood it was doing some diplomatic work in this particular moment. The aliens still a problem? We have complex relationships with numerous species, Picard said carefully. So yes. Duke nodded, satisfied. Always yes. Troy leaned forward slightly. Mr. Nukem, I'm sensing that you're, she paused, visibly recalibrating, extremely comfortable, despite being 3 centuries from your home, aboard an unfamiliar vessel, with no apparent means of return. Duke looked at her. You're reading my feelings? I'm an empath, yes. He considered this with the brief, incurious attention of a man who had encountered stranger things before breakfast on a slow week. What am I feeling? Troy opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. Certainty, she said finally. Almost entirely certainty, with a layer underneath that I can only describe as, she searched for the word, appetite. That's accurate, Duke confirmed. Picard pressed on. The rift that brought you here bore energy signatures consistent with technology we don't recognize. Can you tell us what caused it? Duke thought about this for approximately 1 second. Was fighting a cycloid overlord variant. Big eye, lots of guns. Had some kind of dimensional tech it was charging up. Figured if I blew it up fast enough, it wouldn't matter. He paused. Usually works. Usually, Riker repeated. Nobody's perfect. Data looked up from his pad. The dimensional destabilization, caused by detonating a charged interreality. Aperture device without controlled discharge sequencing would theoretically create a rift, Duke said. Yeah, I was there. Data blinked. You understood the mechanics? Didn't need to understand it. Needed to shoot it. He looked at the android with the patient expression of a man explaining a very simple principle. Understanding why something explodes and making it explode are 2 different skills. I've got one of them. Data made a note. The note said, pragmatic epistemology. Unconventional but internally consistent. Picard laced his fingers together on the table. This was the moment. He could feel it, where the conversation needed to arrive somewhere useful. The man across from him was not hostile. He was not, despite every instinct suggesting otherwise, unintelligent. He was simply operating from a framework so fundamentally different from the Federation's that they were essentially 2 different species of problem solver, sitting 3 feet apart. Mr. Nukem, he said, and something in his tone shifted, not softer, but more direct, one serious person addressing another. You are 300 years from your own time, in deep space, aboard a vessel whose mission is exploration and diplomacy. The civilization that produced you also produced us. He let that sit for a moment. We would like to return you to your own time if possible. Until we determine how to do that, I'd ask that you respect the protocols of this ship. Duke was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, stars drifted past at low warp. Your protocols, he said. What do they say about shooting first? They strongly discourage it. And when that doesn't work, we find another way. Duke looked at him for a long beat. Then he took his boot off the table, slowly, deliberately, a concession that was also somehow a declaration, and leaned forward, forearms on the polished surface. I'll tell you what, Captain, he said. I'll try it your way, right up until your way stops working. The corner of his mouth moved. Then we do it my way. Deal. It was not, Picard reflected, the worst terms he had ever been offered. He had negotiated with the Cardassians. He had sat across a table from the Borg Queen. He had, on one occasion, agreed to terms set by an entity that existed outside linear time. Agreed, he said, and extended his hand. Duke Nukem shook it. His grip was, predictably, extraordinary. Riker waited until they were done. We should get you quarters, he said, standing. I'll have someone show you. And a tour, Duke said, already rising to his full height. I want to see the weapons. Riker glanced at Picard. Picard's expression was the practiced neutral of a man, filing the moment away for his memoirs. Mr. Data, Riker said, would you show our guest to the armory? Data stood, pad tucked under one arm, already composing a supplementary report. Of course, Commander. He looked at Duke with the open, unguarded curiosity that was one of his most genuinely endearing qualities. I should inform you in advance that our weapons technology may not meet your expectations. Duke fell into step beside him as they left the briefing room. The android and the action hero moving down the corridor together with the energy of a pairing. That should not have worked and somehow immediately did. What VE you got? Duke asked. Phasers, primarily. Several settings, ranging from stun to stun, Duke said. Yes. You've got a setting called stun. It is frequently quite effective. I have a gun called the Devastator. Data processed this. I see, he said. And then, after a pause that contained genuine interest, how large are the projectiles? Their voices faded down the corridor. Behind them, in the briefing room, Riker looked at Picard with an expression that balanced amusement and professional concern in roughly equal measure. Well, Riker said. Indeed, said Picard, and reached for his Earl Grey. Lieutenant Commander Worf, son of Moke, had held the position of Chief of Security aboard the Enterprise D for years. In that time, he had faced Romulans, Borg, rogue Klingon, possessed crew members, holodeck malfunctions of a disturbingly combat-oriented nature, and one incident involving Olaxena, Troy that he had formally requested be struck from his personnel record. He had maintained order. He had defended the ship. He had done so with the absolute conviction that security was not merely a function, but a sacred responsibility, the physical expression of everything the ship stood for, translated into vigilance and controlled force. He had not, in any of this, anticipated Duke Nukem. It started at 0600 the following morning, ship's time, when Worf arrived at the security office to find Duke already there, not waiting outside. Inside, seated behind Worf's desk, feet up, going through the weapons locker inventory on a pad, with the focused attention of a man doing serious professional research. Worf stopped in the doorway. Duke looked up. Morning. He held up the pad. Your stun settings go up to 8. That's something. That, Worf said, in a voice like gravel being compressed into a smaller volume of gravel, is my desk. Good desk. Duke set the pad down. Solid. I like the chair. He did not move. What followed was 45 seconds of silence, so loaded it had its own structural integrity. Worf was a Klingon warrior with decades of combat experience and a personal pain threshold that had impressed Cardassian torturers. Duke Nukem had once fought his way through an alien mothership, using a weapon that fired shrunk enemies as projectiles, and had considered it a relaxing afternoon. Neither man blinked. Then Duke stood, picked up the pad, and handed it back to Worf, with a nod that contained something approaching professional respect, the acknowledgement of one security-minded individual to another. Your armory's got gaps, Duke said. No area denial weapons. Nothing with splash radius above what your people call heavy. You've got good close-range options, but your mid-range anti-personnel spread is. Our weapons, Worf said, taking the pad with dignity, are calibrated to Federation engagement protocols. Your engagement protocols get people killed. The silence that followed. This statement was different from the first one. Sharper, more specific. Worf set the pad on the desk with deliberate care. You are a guest on this vessel. You will respect. I'm a guy who's been in more firefights than anyone on this ship combined. Duke said, without heat, without ego, just the flat delivery of a man stating measurable fact. I'm not disrespecting your protocols. I'm telling you they've got holes. He crossed his arms. Thought you'd want to know. Worf stared at him for a long moment. The Klingon's instinct was to object, to assert the primacy of Starfleet doctrine, to defend the system he had sworn to uphold. But underneath that instinct, buried under years of Federation service, was something older and more honest, the warrior's recognition that a man who had genuinely survived what Duke Nukem had survived was worth listening to, regardless of how infuriating his delivery was. Show me, Worf said, through his teeth. Duke showed him. They spent 2 hours in Holodeck 3, running combat scenarios that Worf had designed himself over years of careful, tactical refinement. Standard engagements, Borg boarding party, Romulan ambush in narrow corridors, armed hostage situation with civilian variables. Duke ran each one. He ran them fast. He ran them loudly, with a complete disregard for the elegant minimalism of Starfleet's preferred approach. And he ran them without a single casualty on the friendly side. His methods were, by Federation standards, appalling. He used overwhelming force as a first resort. He moved constantly, never taking cover so much as using it as a brief suggestion before moving again. He made decisions at a speed that looked reckless and turned out, on review, to be the product of a kind of extreme situation, pattern recognition that Worf had only previously encountered in the best Klingon warriors he had known. He also, during the Borg scenario, said things to the holographic drones that Worf would not repeat to anyone. After the third scenario, standing in the holodeck as the simulation dissolved around them, Worf was quiet for a long time. "You are reckless," he said finally. "I'm effective," Duke said. "They are not mutually exclusive." "No," Duke agreed. "They're not." He looked at Worf with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of a man who did not deal in subtext. "You're good. Better than most of the guys I've worked with. Faster than you look." A pause. "The Batleth thing is impressive." Worf stood slightly straighter despite himself. The Batleth compliment, delivered without apparent strategy or social lubrication, landed with the clean impact of something genuine. "You fought a Borg before," Worf said. It was not quite a question. Not these specific ones. Fought plenty of things that absorbed damage and kept coming. Duke rolled his shoulder. "Same problem. Different texture. They assimilate organic life. They have taken crew members' eye." Worf stopped. Adjusted. "They are a significant threat. Everything's a significant threat until it isn't." Duke looked at the space where the Borg hologram had been. "The trick is figuring out which part of it can't take a hit. Everything's got a part that can't take a hit." Worf considered this. It was not, he reflected with some discomfort, entirely without strategic merit. Down the corridor, in a different holodeck, a different kind of crisis was developing. Data had, with the best possible intentions, and the characteristic thoroughness that defined everything he did, offered Duke a comprehensive tour of the holodeck's capabilities the previous evening. He had demonstrated historical recreations, relaxation environments, and tactical training simulations. He had explained the safety protocols. He had been very clear about the safety protocols. Duke had listened politely and then, this morning, returned alone with a very specific request. The holodeck had given him what he asked for because the holodeck, fundamentally, was a machine that fulfilled requests, and Duke's request had been technically within parameters. If those parameters were being read generously at speed by a man with an extensive vocabulary for alien combat environments. Holodeck 2 currently contained the streets of a city under full alien invasion. 17 different enemy types pulled from Duke's own descriptions during yesterday's tour. A weapons cache that had required the replicator to work harder than it had in 6 months. And Duke Nukem at the center of it, absolutely in his element, moving through the simulated chaos with the focused joy of a man who had found his natural habitat. The problem was the power draw. Lieutenant Commander LaForge noticed at first a spike in the EPS conduits feeding Holodeck 2 that suggested either a serious system fault or someone had asked the holodeck to simulate something considerably more complex than the standard parameters were designed for. He pulled up the program specifications from engineering, read them twice, and then called the bridge. "Commander Riker," Geordi said, "you might want to take a look at holodeck 2. Riker arrived to find the corridor outside the holodeck vibrating slightly, which corridors were not supposed to do. Through the arch he could see, or rather hear, primarily, an extremely involved simulation of what appeared to be urban warfare on a scale that the holodeck was maintaining with visible effort, its systems cycling hard to keep up with the scope of the program. In the middle of it, Duke Nukem was having the time of his life. Riker watched for a full 30 seconds. He watched Duke clear a simulated city block with a weapon that the computer had apparently constructed from his verbal description. Alone, something large, loud, and deeply satisfying from a purely physics standpoint. He watched the holographic alien forces respond with increasing aggression as the program's adaptive difficulty tried to catch up with its participant. He watched the holodecks environmental systems push to full capacity, maintaining the scale of the destruction. Then he tapped his comm badge. Riker to Picard. "Go ahead, number 1. Our guest has discovered the holodeck, sir." A pause. "How bad?" Riker watched a simulated building facade collapse with impressive accuracy. "The ship's not in danger." Another pause. "Yet." "Understood. Invite him to dinner." something with sufficient protein. A beat. And notify Counselor Troy. Riker closed the channel and leaned against the corridor wall, watching through the arch with the expression of a man who had learned, over years of deep space service, to find a certain pleasure in the moments when the universe was simply, undeniably strange. Duke emerged from the holodeck 40 minutes later, weapons smoking, sunglasses on, looking satisfied in the way that only a man who had just done exactly what he was built to do could look. He saw Riker waiting and stopped. "Good program," Duke said. "The ship noticed," Riker replied. Duke looked faintly, briefly, almost imperceptibly apologetic. "I'll dial it back. Approximately 50% should keep us at warp," Riker said. Duke nodded. Then he looked at Riker. Really looked. The assessing gaze of one combat-experienced person evaluating another. "You've seen action," he said. Riker shrugged one shoulder. "Some. You're not soft like the rest of them. I'll take that as a compliment." It was one. Duke started down the corridor, Riker falling into step beside him. "This dinner happening. Captain's mess. 1900 hours. They serving anything real, or is it all out of a machine?" "The replicator produces excellent. Real food, Commander." Riker smiled. "I'll see what I can do." Data had, in his years of service aboard the Enterprise, undertaken numerous projects aimed at better understanding the full spectrum of human experience. He had studied comedy, practiced painting, learned multiple musical instruments, and spent a considerable amount of time attempting to understand the specific social phenomenon of relaxation. These projects had produced mixed results. His violin playing was technically flawless and emotionally approximate. His jokes landed with the precision of a man who understood joke architecture without quite inhabiting joke spirit, but he pursued them with the genuine conviction that understanding was its own reward, regardless of outcome. Duke Nukem represented a new category of project entirely. Data had been observing him for 31 hours, 14 minutes, and approximately 40 seconds. He had compiled 17 pads of notes. He had run the data through 4 separate analytical frameworks and arrived, each time at the same conclusion. Duke Nukem was, by every measurable metric, an outlier so extreme that the metrics themselves seemed to be questioning their own relevance. The physical data alone was remarkable. Duke's baseline cardiovascular performance exceeded peak human norms by margins that suggested either significant genetic modification or the kind of physiological conditioning that implied his body had spent decades treating extreme trauma as routine exercise. His reflexes tested at 340 milliseconds for complex stimulus. Response, not superhuman by the standards of species the Enterprise regularly encountered, but extraordinary for a baseline human of his era. His pain tolerance, assessed indirectly through behavioral observation during the holodeck session, appeared to be configured somewhere between impressive and implausible. The behavioral data was more interesting. Data had identified 17 distinct one-line statements Duke had made in 31 hours that appeared to function simultaneously as humor, threat assessment, philosophical position, and identity declaration. He had cataloged them, analyzed their structural components, and arrived at the conclusion that they were a form of highly compressed communication developed by a mind that processed dangerous situations at speed and had learned to convey complex information in minimum syllables. It was, data reflected, not entirely unlike the efficiency principles underlying certain Vulcan communication styles, though the content diverged considerably. He found Duke in the ship's gymnasium at 0730, which was where Duke apparently preferred to be when he wasn't in the holodeck. The armory, the mess, or conducting what Worf had grimly described in his morning report as unsolicited tactical consultations with members of the security team. Duke was lifting weights that the gymnasium's equipment had been reconfigured to provide at his request, loads that represented the upper limit of what the machinery could generate, which data calculated as roughly 3 times the maximum any current crew member used. Data sat on a nearby bench, pad in hand, and waited. After 4 minutes, Duke racked the weight, picked up a towel, and looked at the android. "You've been following me," Duke said. "Not accusatory. Observational. I have been conducting research," Data said. You represent a unique opportunity to study a variant of human development that does not appear in our historical records, as your existence appears to have diverged from our timeline at some point. Prior to the 22nd century, Duke sat down on the bench across from him. You're saying I don't exist in your history books? Not specifically, no, though I have found several historical references to a series of alien incursions in the early 21st century that were apparently resolved by a single individual. Data tilted his head. The historical consensus attributes this to a coordinated military response. I am beginning to suspect the historical consensus may have been simplified. Duke's expression shifted. Not quite a smile, not quite satisfaction. Somewhere in the specific neighborhood where those two things lived. Somebody cleaned up the story. It would appear so. Typical. Duke leaned forward, forearms on his knees. He looked at Data with the direct, uncomplicated attention he gave most things, the gaze of a man who did not practice social indirection. What are you? I am an android, Data said. An artificial life form created by Dr. Noonien Sohm. I have a positronic brain, which allows for. You feel anything? Data paused. This question, simple in construction, had occupied considerable philosophical real estate in his life. That is a matter of ongoing debate, he said carefully. I have an emotion chip which I do not always activate. I experience functional analogs to emotion, states that influence my processing and behavior in ways that parallel emotional responses without being definitively identical to them. Duke looked at him for a moment. So you feel things but you're not sure if they count. Data considered this reduction. That is a reasonably accurate summary, yes. Duke leaned back. I've met soldiers like that. Guys who'd been through enough that they weren't sure what they were feeling qualified as feeling anymore. He paused. They were still feeling. They just needed someone to tell them it counted. Data was quiet for 2.3 seconds, which for him was a significant pause. That is a surprisingly perceptive observation. You sound surprised. I apologize. I did not intend to imply. Don't apologize, Duke said. People keep underestimating me. I'm used to it. He picked up his towel. Most guys who look like me, people figure the brains. Decorative. He tapped his temple once with 2 fingers. It's not. Data made a note. Then, because he was Data, and the question had been cued in his analytical framework for approximately 19 hours, he said, May I ask you something of a personal nature? Duke gestured. Go ahead. You have spent a significant portion of your life in extreme mortal danger. You have faced adversaries of overwhelming power and survived circumstances that, statistically, should have resulted in your death on numerous occasions. Data tilted his head. Do you experience fear? Duke was quiet for a moment. Outside the gymnasium windows, stars streaked past at warp. Yeah, he said finally. Sure. And yet your behavioral responses under threat conditions show no measurable. That's because I figured something out a long time ago, Duke said. He looked at the android with the direct clarity of a man stating something he had learned the hard way and was not interested in dressing up. Fear's information. It's your brain telling you something's dangerous. That's useful. He stood, stretching to his full height. The mistake people make is thinking scared and stopped are the same thing. He looked at Data. They're not. Data processed this for 1.1 seconds. You experience fear, but have decoupled it from behavioral inhibition. I move toward the thing that scares me, Duke said simply. Every time. Been doing it so long it's automatic. He paused. The aliens helped. Hard to stay inhibited when something's trying to eat your planet. Data added 3 more pages to his report and flagged 2 sections for urgent further analysis. They walked together to the mess hall afterward, an unlikely pair moving through the morning corridor. Traffic, crew members stepping aside with expressions ranging from polite to alarmed as. Duke's dimensions required more corridor than the average Starfleet officer. Data walked beside him, pad in hand, asking questions with the focused enthusiasm of a researcher who had found a genuinely new data set. Your primary weapon, the one you called the Devastator, rocket launcher, modified. The modifications you described would not be theoretically possible under conventional. Worked, though. Yes, Data conceded. Empirically, it appears to have worked. He made a note. You mentioned a weapon that fired reduced-scale versions of enemies. The shrinker. The underlying technology would require. I didn't build it. I took it from an alien who was using it on people. Duke's tone on this last part carried a specific quality, something that was not quite anger and not quite disgust, but lived in the territory between them. Figured I'd put it to better use. Data logged this, filed it under ethical framework, pragmatic appropriation for defensive purpose, cross-reference, trophy taking as cultural practice, weapon repurposing in asymmetric conflict. In the mess hall, they found Counselor Troy at a table with a cup of something warm, reviewing crew evaluations. She looked up as they arrived, and her expression did the specific thing it did when she was reading an emotional state she found professionally interesting. Duke got something from the replicator. He had spent 20 minutes the previous evening teaching it to approximate food he recognized, with mixed but improving results, and sat across from her without particular ceremony. Troy watched him eat for a moment. You slept 4 hours, she said. Ship's records show you were in the holodeck by 0430. 4 hours is fine. For most humans, 4 hours of sleep would produce measurable cognitive. I'm not most humans. He said it without pride, just precision. A statement of observed fact. Troy leaned forward slightly. In her professional capacity, she had interviewed Klingon warriors, Vulcan diplomats, and one individual who technically didn't exist. She had developed a practiced, gentle method of approaching difficult personal histories, a way of creating space for people to share things they carried alone. She deployed it now, carefully. What was it like? She asked. Earth. During the invasions. Duke chewed, swallowed, considered. Around them the mess hall hummed with morning routine, crew coming and going, conversations in progress, the ship's life continuing at its usual civilized pace. Loud, he said finally, and then quiet, and then loud again. He looked at his food for a moment. The quiet was worse. Troy held that answer with the careful attention it deserved. Across the table, Data wrote it down. Somewhere in the ship's belly, the warp core pulsed with its steady blue certainty, carrying them all, the captain and his crew and the impossible man from 3 centuries back, deeper into a galaxy that was, as Duke had correctly identified, always and inevitably yes, still a problem. The holodeck, on its second engagement with Duke Nukem, was better prepared. This was because Geordi LaForge had spent an evening personally reconfiguring the power distribution, network feeding holodeck 2, installing what he described in his engineering log as buffer systems for high demand, recreational use, and what he described to his colleagues as Duke proofing. He had raised the EPS conduit capacity by 40%, redistributed secondary power from 3 non-essential systems, and written a custom program limiter that would throttle simulation complexity before it began drawing from propulsion. He had done all of this with the focused competence of a man who loved engineering problems, and he had felt genuinely good about it. Duke found the limiter in 11 minutes and asked the computer to remove it. The computer, following standard holodeck protocols and finding no security restriction on the request, complied. Geordi found out when the lights in his engineering section dimmed briefly at 1400 hours and his console lit up like a Risian festival. Computer, he said, already moving toward the holodeck monitoring station. What is the current power draw on holodeck 2? The computer told him. Geordi stared at the number for a moment. That's not. How is that? He pulled up the program specifications. Read them. Read them again. Oh, he found the limiter. He tapped his comm badge. LaForge to Commander Riker. Go ahead, Geordi. He found the limiter, sir. A pause. How long has it been running at full draw? 11 minutes. We're stable for now, but if he runs it another hour, we'll start seeing EPS variants in the. I'll handle it, Riker said, with the tone of a man adding an item to a list that had been growing steadily since yesterday. He arrived at holodeck 2 to find the arch framing a scene of such elaborate, committed destruction that he stood in the entrance for a full minute simply taking it in. Duke had constructed, or rather, requested, and the holodeck had dutifully generated a scenario of his own design. A coastal city under simultaneous assault from 3 distinct alien factions, each with different tactical profiles, each requiring different approaches. The whole thing layered over a civilian Evacuation that added consequence to every engagement decision. It was, Riker reflected despite himself, extraordinarily sophisticated scenario design. The tactical variables alone implied a mind that thought naturally in three-dimensional threat matrices. The civilian integration meant every engagement had a secondary consideration beyond simple elimination. The three-faction dynamic created resource and attention conflicts that required constant priority reassessment. It was also drawing enough power to notice from orbit. Duke was at the center of it, doing what Duke did, which was everything simultaneously and loudly. He moved through the simulation with the specific quality of motion that Riker had started mentally categorizing as Duke's operational state, not frantic, not reckless in the way it appeared from a distance, but a kind of high-velocity deliberateness, each decision already made before the situation fully presented itself, the body executing while the mind was already 3 moves ahead. Riker stepped through the arch. A holographic alien swung toward him, and he sidestepped instinctively before Duke's voice cut through the noise. "Friendly," Duke announced to the simulation, and the alien targeting shifted away from Riker with the responsiveness of a well-designed program. Riker fell into step behind Duke, navigating the scenario's outer edge. "Having fun. Working," Duke said, without irony. "This is work. Staying sharp is work." Duke cleared a corner, assessed, moved. "You stop training, you get slow. You get slow, something eats you." He glanced at Riker briefly. "Basic." Riker watched him work for another 30 seconds. There was something genuinely compelling about it, the efficiency underneath the spectacle, the way the chaos organized itself around Duke's position like weather patterns around a geographic feature. He made the environment adapt to him rather than adapting to it. It was, Riker thought, the opposite of how Starfleet trained. They taught adaptation, flexibility, the cultivation of options. Duke had apparently decided that the optimal response to a universe full of options was to have one very good answer and apply it faster than the universe could present alternatives. "The power draw," Riker said. "I know. The ship needs. I know." Duke finished the engagement he was in, stepped back, and looked at Riker with the expression of a man who had been expecting this conversation. "I'll run it quieter. I'd appreciate that." Duke looked around the holodeck, at the city, the aliens, the elaborate constructed chaos, with something in his expression that Riker hadn't seen there before. Something that was not quite wistfulness, but occupied adjacent territory. "Back home," Duke said, "this is what every day looked like. Except real." Riker was quiet for a moment. Outside, through the illusion of the holodeck's constructed sky, the actual stars of deep space continued their indifferent burning. "That must have been exhausting," Riker said. Duke looked at him. "It was everything," he said simply. Then he turned back to the simulation controls and began reducing parameters. Methodically, without drama. "I'll keep it under your threshold." Riker nodded. He was halfway to the arch when Duke spoke again without turning around. "Your ship," Duke said. "She's good. Crew's good." A pause. "You've got blind spots, though." Riker stopped. "Oh, you're trained to solve problems by talking first. Fighting second." Duke adjusted another parameter. "Works great until something doesn't want to talk." He looked over his shoulder. "What's your protocol for that?" Riker crossed his arms. "We find a way to make them want to talk." Duke nodded slowly. It was not agreement exactly, more the acknowledgement of a position he had heard before and found insufficient but respected for its sincerity. "There's something in this sector," he said. "I heard your bridge crew talking this morning. Anomalous readings. Something big." Riker's expression shifted fractionally. "You have good ears." "I have survival ears," Duke said. "Different thing." He turned fully now, facing the first officer. "It's not natural, is it? The anomaly." Riker studied him for a moment. The question of how much operational information to share with a man who was technically a civilian, technically a temporal anomaly, technically the most destructive person aboard a ship that prided itself on measured responses. That question had a clean, clear Starfleet answer. Riker had been in Starfleet long enough to know that clean, clear answers and correct answers were not always the same thing. "We're investigating," he said. "Sensor readings consistent with a vessel of considerable mass, traveling without standard drive emissions. Heading this way." Duke processed this with the quick efficiency of a man who had learned to triage information fast. Cloak, possibly, or something we haven't encountered before. Duke looked at the holodeck ceiling for a moment, a gesture that Riker was starting to recognize as his version of thinking. The brief upward glance of a mind running calculations it didn't need to share aloud. How long until it reaches us? Duke asked. At its current heading, 18 hours. Duke nodded. Wake me up when it's 12, he said. I want to be on the bridge. Riker raised an eyebrow. I'll pass the request to the captain. Pass it as a recommendation, Duke said, already turning back to his scaled-down simulation. I've seen what happens when something moves that big without announcing itself. He paused. It's never a surprise party. Riker left Holodeck 2 with the distinct sensation of a man who had gone in to reduce a power, draw and come out with new information about the thing he was already worried about, delivered by someone who had no business being insightful and had been insightful anyway. He made 2 stops on his way back to the bridge. The first was engineering, to tell Geordi that the power draw issue was resolved for now. The second was the captain's ready room. Picard listened to the full report. Holodeck. Power draw, Duke's observation. The recommendation, with the focused stillness he brought to things that required actual thought rather than just decision. He wants to be on the bridge, Picard said. Yes, sir. When the anomaly arrives. Yes, sir. Picard looked at his desk for a moment. Outside his window, the stars were doing what stars did, which was persist. What's your read on him, number 1? Honestly, Riker considered this with the genuine seriousness it deserved. He's not what he looks like, he said finally. Or he is what he looks like. But what he looks like is more than it appears to be. He paused, aware that this was not his most precisely articulated assessment. He's been keeping the planet alive by himself for decades, sir. That does something to a person. Makes them very good at one thing and completely unable to imagine needing to be anything else. And the bridge, Picard said. If something's coming that doesn't want to negotiate, Riker said carefully, I'd rather have him where I can see him than where I can't. Picard was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up his Earl Grey, a fresh cup, still steaming. The replicator, knowing his schedule by now, as well as any person, and looked out at the stars. Grant the request, he said. And number 1, make sure Mr. Worf knows. Worf won't like it. Mr. Worf, Picard said, with the mild certainty of a man who knew his crew absolutely. Doesn't like most things. He manages. The Klingon Empire's relationship with the Federation was, at its most generous description, a work in progress. There had been wars. There had been treaties. There had been periods of cautious alliance that functioned well right up until someone's honor was questioned or someone's territory was misread or some third party with poor diplomatic timing decided to make things interesting. The current era represented one of the more stable stretches of that complicated history, which meant that when the IKS Kortok dropped out of warp 300 kilometers off the Enterprise's port bow and opened a channel without preamble, the bridge crew's collective response was professional tension rather than outright alarm. Picard straightened in his chair. Worf stood at tactical with the contained readiness of a spring under compression. Troy sat to Picard's right, reading the channel before it fully opened. Riker was at his station, steady. Data was at ops, already running comparative analysis on the vessel's configuration against known Klingon registry. And Duke Nukem was standing at the back of the bridge near the turbolift, arms crossed, sunglasses on, watching everything with the patient attention of a man at a sporting event who already knew the sport and was waiting to see how this particular match developed. Picard had granted his bridge request. He had not, however, granted him a chair. The view screen resolved into the face of a Klingon commander, broad, battle-scarred, with the kind of beard that suggested it had survived multiple armed conflicts independently. Commander Korveth, according to Data's quiet identification, 12 years commanding, distinguished record in 3 border engagements, currently assigned to monitor Federation activity in this sector per the terms of a recent joint patrol agreement. Captain Picard, Korveth said, in the specific tone Klingon used when they wanted to convey that courtesy was being extended as a deliberate choice rather than a natural inclination. Our long-range sensors have detected the same anomaly as yours. We are here to observe. Commander, Picard said. matching tone with tone in the careful way of experienced diplomats. We welcome your presence. We are currently conducting our own analysis and would be glad to share data once our assessment is. We do not require Federation assessment, Korveth said. We have our own instruments. Of course, Picard said, without missing a beat. Then perhaps we can compare findings. In the spirit of our current joint patrol agreement. Korveth's eyes moved, just slightly. The fractional shift of a man whose attention had snagged on something unexpected to the back of the bridge. To Duke. Who was that? Korveth said. The bridge crew had, collectively and unconsciously, been waiting for this moment, with the specific anticipation of people who knew it was coming and had not agreed on what to do about it. Picard drew breath to answer. Name's Duke, said Duke, from the back of the bridge. Duke Nukem. I kill aliens for a living. The silence that followed had several distinct layers. There was the professional silence of the bridge crew not reacting. There was the tactical silence of Worf actively choosing not to say something. There was the diplomatic silence of Picard, composing his next 3 sentences simultaneously. And then there was Commander Korveth's silence, which lasted approximately 4 seconds and ended with something that was unmistakably a laugh. It was brief. It was not a warm laugh. It was the specific Klingon laugh that meant, this is either the most arrogant thing I have heard today or the most honest thing, and I am not yet certain which. But either way it is interesting. A warrior, Korveth said. He was looking at Duke now with an entirely different quality of attention. On a Federation vessel. Temporarily, Duke said. He is a guest, Picard said, with calm precision, who has been assisting with tactical analysis. Tactical analysis, Korveth repeated, in the tone of a man tasting a phrase he found suspicious. His gaze moved back to Duke. What do you know of the anomaly? Big thing moving quiet, Duke said. Nothing that size moves. Quiet on purpose unless it doesn't. Want you ready when it arrives. Korveth was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Picard. Your guest speaks plainly. He has that quality, Picard said. It is not, Korveth said slowly. The worst quality. He turned his attention back to Duke. You have faced enemies of this kind before. Things that show up big and unannounced. Duke shrugged one shoulder. That's most of my career. Korveth studied him across the view screen, with the focused assessment of a commander who made fast evaluations for professional reasons and had stayed alive because most of them were correct. You are human, he said, not as an insult, but as a data point. Last time I checked. And yet you speak of your career as though it is that of a warrior. It is, Duke said simply. Another Klingon silence. A different kind this time. The silence of a man recategorizing. The anomaly, Korveth said. Returning to Picard, but with an energy that had subtly shifted, will reach optimal engagement. Range in 14 hours. Our tactical projections suggested is a vessel of at minimum 4 kilometers in length. He paused. We have seen nothing like it in Klingon records. Nor in ours, Picard said. And now the diplomatic register gave way to the more direct mode of 2 commanders, sharing genuine concern. We are currently attempting to raise it on all frequencies. No response thus far. Then it does not wish to communicate, Korveth said. That may not be. Captain. Korveth's voice dropped a fraction, carrying the specific weight of a warrior saying something he considered obvious, but was choosing to say, diplomatically anyway. In my experience, things that move at us in silence and do not answer our hails are not preparing a greeting. From the back of the bridge, Duke said nothing. He didn't need to. The slight shift in his posture, the barely perceptible adjustment of a man whose instincts had just been corroborated by an external source, said it for him. Picard looked at the view screen for a moment. Then he made the decision that good commanders made when the situation required it, the decision to prioritize correctness over comfort. Commander, he said, I propose a coordination protocol. We share sensor data in real time, maintain separate tactical postures, and establish a joint communication window to the anomaly. If it responds to neither of us independently, a combined hail may produce different results. Korveth considered this. His expression did the specific Klingon thing of working through objections and finding them insufficient. Agreed, he said finally. We will transmit our sensor package within the hour. He paused. And, Captain, keep your warrior where you can use him. He closed the channel. The bridge held its post-communication quiet for a moment. Then Riker looked at Duke with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally amused in equal measure. That went better than expected. He's practical, Duke said. Klingon I can work with. Worf turned from his tactical station very slowly. He was facing a situation that contained, in approximately equal proportions, professional objection, racial pride, personal irritation, and the specific discomfort of finding himself in reluctant agreement with someone he had decided not to like. You, Worf said to Duke, in the tone of a man choosing words with unusual care, do not represent the standard Federation approach to Klingon relations. No, Duke said. The standard approach requires cultural sensitivity, diplomatic framing, and a thorough understanding of. I told him what I thought, Duke said. He respected it. That's the whole thing. Worf opened his mouth, closed it, turned back to his console, with the controlled dignity of a man who would not be giving ground on this topic but had temporarily run out of the specific ground he needed to hold. Mr. Data, Picard said. Begin joint sensor correlation with the Cortox incoming package. I want a full profile on the anomaly within 2 hours. Understood, Captain. Number 1, Tactical Contingency Review. All department heads at 1800. Yes, sir. Picard stood. A signal the bridge read as the end of the immediate phase and the beginning of the preparation phase. He looked at Duke, who was still at the back of the bridge, still watching everything, still wearing the patient expression of a man who understood that the next phase of any situation was always the same. You waited, you prepared, and then the thing came. Mr. Nukem, Picard said. Captain, the Tactical Contingency Review at 1800. A pause, brief, deliberate. I'd like you there. Duke looked at him for a moment. Something passed across his face that was not quite surprise and not quite gratitude. Something more functional than either. The acknowledgement of one professional extending operational respect to another. I'll be there, he said. He left the bridge through the turbolift, boots heavy on the deck. The doors closed behind him. The bridge returned to its preparations, data correlating, Riker reviewing. Worf pulling up tactical files with the focused energy of a man who had channeled his complicated feelings into productive readiness. Troy sat quietly for a moment before speaking. Captain, she said. Picard looked at her. The anomaly, she said carefully. I've been trying to read it since it appeared on sensors. She paused. I can't. Picard understood what that meant. Troy's empathic abilities were not infallible, not absolute. There were species she couldn't read, distances too great, shielding too thorough. But there was a specific quality to her expression, now that moved beyond the technical limitation of no signal. What does it feel like, he asked. Troy looked at the view screen, at the stars that looked the same as they always did, but were somehow not. It feels, she said, like something that has already decided. The warp core hummed below them. The stars burned on. 14 hours away. Something 4 kilometers long moved through space without a sound, heading directly toward them, not answering hails, not slowing down, with the absolute conviction of something that had, as Troy said, already decided. In the turbolift on his way to the lower decks, Duke Nukem cracked his knuckles. Here we go, he said to nobody, in the tone of a man greeting an old friend. The tactical briefing at 1800 hours filled the main conference room with the senior staff and one significant anomaly of its own. Department heads arranged themselves around the table with the practiced efficiency of people who had done this before under pressure and knew how to make the space work. LaForge beside Data. Crusher at the far end with her medical readiness assessment already prepared. Troy to Picard's right, Riker to his left. Worf standing at the display wall with tactical overlays already cued. The room had the specific quality of concentrated, professional focus that Picard had always found, privately, one of the more reassuring things in his life. These people, in this room, working the problem. Duke sat at the corner of the table nearest the display wall, which he had apparently chosen because it gave him the clearest sightline to both the tactical overlays and the door. He had a cup of something from the replicator that approximated coffee in color and function, if not in any way that would satisfy a coffee purist. and he was watching the senior staff settle, with the attentive patience of a man who had learned to read rooms as a survival skill. Data brought up the sensor composite on the main display, the Enterprise's readings merged with the Cortex package into a single, integrated profile. The room looked at it. The room was quiet for a moment. In the specific way rooms got quiet when the thing on the screen was bigger than expected. 4.3 kilometers, Data said. Approximately. The outer boundary is not clearly defined. There appears to be a field of some kind surrounding the vessel's hull that distorts precise measurement. The mass reading is consistent with a vessel of that scale constructed with materials denser than standard duranium alloys. He paused. It is moving at warp 6.2 without detectable warp field emissions. That's not possible, LaForge said immediately, leaning forward. Warp 6 without a field would tear the ship apart, Data agreed. Under standard physics, the vessel appears to be operating under physics that are not entirely standard. Shields? Riker asked. Indeterminate. There is significant energy concentration along what we believe to be the outer hull, but its function is unclear. It may be propulsion. It may be defensive. It may be both. Or it may be something we do not have a category for. Weapons? Worf asked. Unknown. The energy signatures do not match any weapon system in Federation or Klingon records. Data looked at Worf. Nor in Romulan, Cardassian, Ferengi, or Dominion records, which I checked as a precaution. Life signs? Crusher asked. This is perhaps the most interesting finding, Data said, and brought up a secondary overlay. There are life signs aboard the vessel. Thousands of them. But they are. He paused in the way he paused when language was inadequate and he was selecting the least inadequate option, unusual. The biosignatures are partially organic, partially synthetic. But unlike Borg signatures in several significant respects, the synthetic component appears to be integrated differently. More thorough. The word landed on the table and sat there. Picard looked at the display for a long moment. Thorough, he said. The organic component in each individual signature is present but appears to be subordinate. The synthetic elements are not augmenting the organic. They appear to be containing it. Crusher leaned forward. Containing it how? As one might contain a power source, Data said quietly. Another silence. A different quality to this one. The specific silence of a room that had heard something. It needed a moment to fully absorb. Duke had been watching the display throughout without speaking. Now he set down his cup. So they're running on people, he said. The room looked at him. The synthetic stuff, the ship, the field, whatever it does, it's using the organic signatures as fuel, or processing power, or both. He looked at Data. That what you're saying? Data considered this reduction for 1.4 seconds. It is a simplified but not inaccurate interpretation of the available data, yes. Duke nodded slowly. Something in his expression had changed. Not fear, never quite fear, but the specific recalibration of a man who had just identified the category of threat he was dealing with and was updating his approach accordingly. How many people aboard? Based on the signature density, Data said, our best estimate is between 8 and 12,000 individual biosignatures. Duke looked at the display. 8 to 12,000 people, reduced to components of a machine that moved through space in impossible silence toward a Federation ship and a Klingon warbird, without answering their hails. Any of them savable? He asked. The question was quiet. Quieter than most things, Duke said. It landed differently because of it. Crusher answered, without knowing more about the integration process. I can't. We'd need to examine the signatures more closely before I could say with any confidence whether. Is there a way to get closer? Duke asked. Not to Crusher specifically. To the room. Riker looked at Picard. Picard looked at the display. A probe might get us better resolution on the biosignatures without closing distance. LaForge said, already working through the problem. If I modify a Class 3 with enhanced bioscanner arrays and boost the gain on the synthetic signal filters, we might be able to separate the individual signatures clearly enough to do it, Picard said. LaForge was already on his feet. Worf brought up the tactical overlay. If it is using organic life as a power source, it will require more. The course it is on takes it through this sector. He highlighted a region on the display, which contains 3 inhabited systems. Population in the millions. The room absorbed this. What's its tactical profile? Riker asked. Best assessment. If it decides we're in the way. Worf's expression was the controlled one he wore when the answer to a question was bad and he was delivering it. Professionally anyway. Based on the energy concentration readings. It could disable the Enterprise in a single engagement cycle. The Kortok would fare similarly. He paused. Together, with optimal coordination, we might be able to slow it. Another pause, shorter. Not stop it. Duke was looking at the tactical overlay with the focused attention of someone doing fast mental geometry. It's going to the inhabited systems, he said. That appears to be its trajectory. Yes, Data said. Then it's not here for us. Duke stood, moving to the display wall, studying the overlay up close. We're in the way. That's different. He traced the trajectory with one finger, not touching the display. It's not hunting. It's harvesting. The word was worse than anything else that had been said in the room so far. If it's harvesting, Duke continued, and his voice had the flat, terrible clarity of a man who had seen versions of this before and was working from experience. Then it's been doing this for a while. You don't build a 4-kilometer ship that runs on people overnight. He looked at Picard. This thing has a supply chain, a route, planets it's already been to. Data was already running queries, cross-referencing known, unexplained mass casualty events in this region over the past. He paused as results populated. The past 40 years shows 7 incidents of complete or near-complete population disappearance from small colony worlds, previously attributed to various causes. Pirate activity, natural disaster, voluntary relocation in 3 cases. He looked up. The trajectory connects all 7. The room was very quiet. Picard stood. When he stood in briefings, it meant the analysis phase was ending and the decision phase was beginning. And his crew felt the shift the way you feel a weather change. Not dramatic, just present. We cannot allow it to reach the inhabited systems, he said. We also cannot simply engage something of that scale without better understanding of its capabilities, its weaknesses, and the status of the people aboard. He looked around the table. Our objectives are probe data within the hour, joint tactical protocol with Commander Corveth, and an attempt at contact on every available frequency simultaneously, including any non-standard communication modalities Mr. Data can construct from the sensor profile. He looked at Duke last. Mr. Nukem, you said you've seen things like this before. Not this specific thing, the category. Things that consume, Duke said. Yeah. How did you stop them? Duke looked at the display, at the track of the vessel, the 7 vanished colonies, the 3 inhabited systems ahead. He was quiet for a moment in a way he rarely was, and the room felt it. The ones that consume, he said, they always have a center. Something that runs the whole operation. You don't fight the ship. You find the center and you hit it hard. Enough that the rest stops working. He looked at Picard. Every time, without exception. And if the center is surrounded by 12,000 people being used as a power source, Crusher said, and her voice was steady. In the way doctors' voices got. Steady when the question was hard. What then? Duke met her eyes. In his face was the answer she was afraid of. Not cold, not careless, but the expression of a man who had stood in front of this exact question before, in different forms, and had learned the terrible arithmetic of it. Then you find out if there's another way first, he said. And you look hard. A pause. And if there isn't, there will be another way, Picard said. Duke looked at him. Picard met the look with the specific quality that was his alone, the absolute, load-bearing conviction of a man who had turned impossible situations into possible ones through sheer refusal to accept the arithmetic. Duke held the look for a moment. Then he nodded. 12 hours, he said. Let's find it. The probe launched at 2,100 hours and returned data at 2143. Geordi had done extraordinary work in 3 hours. The modified Class 3 carried bioscanner arrays reconfigured from medical diagnostic components, synthetic signal filters rebuilt from first principles, based on data sensor analysis, and a custom transmission protocol that compressed the data stream to get maximum resolution through minimum exposure time. It was, by any measure, a remarkable piece of field engineering, accomplished under pressure with inadequate sleep and the background awareness that whatever was out there could presumably do things to a probe that. Probes were not designed to survive. The probe survived. It transmitted everything. It then went silent in a way that suggested it had been noticed. They analyzed the data in 4 hours. Data processed continuously. LaForge interpreted the technical readings. Crusher worked the biosignature profiles with the focused intensity of a physician who had decided that 12,000 unknowns were her patients until proven otherwise. Duke sat in the corner of the situation room they'd commandeered, reviewing everything as it came in, saying little, thinking visibly. At 0200 hours, Crusher looked up from her station with the expression doctors wore when the news was bad, but not as bad as the worst case. They're alive, she said. All of them, or most of them. The integration is extensive, but it's not. They're not dead. They're in a suppressed state. Metabolically minimal. Neurologically. Somewhere between deep unconsciousness and something. I don't have a clean medical term. 4. She pulled up a representative signature on the display. The synthetic components are sustaining their biological functions while drawing on their, I think it's neural energy, bioelectric output from organic nervous systems, amplified and directed. She paused. It's extraordinarily efficient. Horrifying, but efficient. Can they be extracted? Picard asked. I don't know yet. The integration points are complex. It would require detailed examination of each individual case and probably technology more sophisticated than anything we currently have. She looked at the display. But they're not beyond recovery in principle. That's what I can say with confidence. It is something, Picard said, and meant it. Data brought up his structural analysis. The probe data allows a significantly more detailed map of the vessel's interior architecture. There is a central structure here. He highlighted a region at the vessel's geometric core that shows energy concentration, an order of magnitude higher than anywhere else aboard. It is shielded heavily, but the shielding itself creates a detectable signature that confirms it has the primary processing node for the entire system. Duke looked at the highlighted region. The center, he said. The center, data confirmed. What's between the outer hull and that node? Duke asked. Approximately 2 kilometers of interior structure. Based on the probe's passive imaging, it is, data paused, which was unusual, dense, mechanically complex. The synthetic components of the vessel's interior appear to be partially biological in construction, grown rather than manufactured, in several sections. A living ship, LaForge said quietly. In the most literal sense, Data agreed. The vessel and its passengers appear to be functionally integrated into a single organism. The ship does not carry the people. The ship is, in significant part, made of them. The silence after this statement had a particular weight to it that even the ship's ambient systems seemed to respect. Riker broke it practically. Weapons assessment. If we need to engage. Data pulled up the energy profile. The outer field concentrations appear to function as both propulsion and a deflection system. Direct weapons fire will be significantly degraded. Our estimates suggest phaser effectiveness at approximately 12 to 15% of standard yield. Against that field, photon torpedoes somewhat better, perhaps 30% effective. The Cortox disruptors show slightly higher theoretical penetration due to their different energy profile. He paused. These are insufficient to disable a vessel of this scale. 12%, Worf said, with the tone of a man who respected honesty while finding it deeply inconvenient. However, Data said, there is a potential vulnerability. The central node, the processing core, is the origin point of the field. If the core were disrupted, the field would likely collapse, potentially disabling the vessel entirely. The difficulty is accessing it through 2 kilometers of integrated biological mechanical structure. Everyone in the room understood what that meant. 2 kilometers of structure that was, in significant part, made of people. Duke had been listening. He was standing now, arms crossed, looking at the structural map with the expression of a man solving an engineering problem he didn't particularly enjoy the terms of. There's a pathway, he said. Data looked at the map. There are several internal transit channels, likely maintenance or energy routing conduits. They are narrow. How narrow? Data ran the measurement. The largest is approximately 1.4 meters in diameter. Duke looked at his own shoulders, made a brief, pragmatic calculation. I've fit through worse. You are not suggesting, Worf said slowly, that you enter the vessel alone. I'm suggesting that a small team, or one person, moving fast and quiet through the internal channels has a better chance of reaching that core than anything we can throw at the outside. Duke looked at Picard. You hit the outside. You use 12% effective weapons against a 4-kilometer hull, and you give it time to respond. You go inside, he paused. Inside's always the same, regardless of how big the outside is. You'd be moving through structure that is partially composed of living people. Crusher said. I know, Duke said. The two words carried something that his louder statements didn't. A specific gravity. The weight of a man who had done things he didn't enjoy doing because they needed doing, and who was not pretending that weight didn't exist. Picard looked at the map for a long time. There is another consideration, Data said, and something in his tone made the room pay attention in a specific way. The probe data includes an anomalous signal embedded in the vessel's outer field emissions. It is low frequency, non-standard, and repetitive. He brought it up on audio, a pattern, cycling, with the irregular rhythm of something that had not been machine-generated. The room listened. It could be a natural resonance artifact, Data said. Or, it's a signal, Duke said immediately. That is my assessment as well, Data said. Someone aboard is attempting to communicate. The room recalibrated around this fact. 12,000 people in suppressed unconsciousness, metabolically minimal, neurologically somewhere between sleep and oblivion, and one of them, or some of them, generating a signal from inside that condition, either fighting it or working within it. Can we decode it? Riker asked. I have been working on the pattern since identifying it, Data said. It is complex. The carrier medium is not designed for communication, and whoever is generating it is working against significant constraints. But there is structure. There is intent. He looked up. Give me 2 more hours. You have one, Picard said. We're at 11 hours to intercept. Data nodded and began working, at a speed that made the rest of the room feel gently inadequate by comparison. Duke moved to the window. Outside, the stars were ordinary, the same stars they always were, indifferent and permanent, framing the space where something enormous was moving toward them in the dark. He'd spent most of his life looking at skies like this, Earth's sky, usually during the brief moments between one crisis and the next when you could look up and remember that the universe was very large and most of what was, and it was trying to get along the same as everyone else. Most of it. Troy appeared beside him, quiet in the way she sometimes was, not sneaking, just not announcing herself, arriving the way people arrived when they wanted to, stand next to someone rather than at them. You've made a decision, she said. Getting there, Duke said. You're going to go in, she said. Not a question. He looked at the stars. Somebody has to. Picard won't send you alone. He won't send anyone, Duke said. That'll be the argument. Too dangerous, too uncertain. We need more data. We need another option. He paused. He's not wrong. He's also not the only one who gets to decide what risks are acceptable. Troy was quiet for a moment. You'd go without authorization. I'd go when it needed doing, Duke said, which was not a direct answer, and both of them knew it. You could die in there, she said. Not dramatically, just cleanly, as a fact she was placing on the table between them. Duke looked at her for the first time since she'd appeared beside him. The sunglasses were off. He'd taken to removing them in lower light situations, and the Situation Room at 0200 hours qualified. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had looked at his own death enough times that it had become a familiar rather than a stranger. I could die out here, he said. Difference is, in there, it matters which direction I'm moving when it happens. Troy held his gaze for a moment. Her empathic sense, which had been reading Duke Nukem for 3 days as a single, overwhelming note of certainty, found something else underneath it now, something quieter, more complex, the emotional residue of a man who had been doing the terrible arithmetic for a very long time and had learned to live inside the calculation, without letting it hollow him out. It was, she thought, one of the braver things she had encountered in her professional life. Not the certainty, the thing underneath it. I'll tell the captain, she said quietly, that you're ready. Duke picked up his sunglasses and put them back on. Tell him I've been ready, he said. I was just waiting for him to catch up. Data decoded the signal at 0317 hours. It was not a language. It was older than language, a pattern of bioelectric pulses structured in the universal mathematical framework that sentient minds across the galaxy had independently arrived at as the first vocabulary of contact, prime numbers, geometric sequences, the Fibonacci pattern, the intellectual equivalent of knocking on a wall. We are here. We think. We know you are there. But threaded through the mathematics, in the irregular spacing between pulses, was something that took data an additional 23 minutes to extract and another 7 to interpret, a spatial map, rough, degraded, assembled from whatever means the sender had available, from inside a state of near total neurological suppression, but a map nonetheless. It showed the interior of the vessel, and it showed a path. Picard looked at the decoded map for a long time without speaking. It was 0400 hours, and the bridge had the particular quality of deep shift operations, a skeleton crew running the essential systems, the lighting at 2/3, the ship moving at reduced warp on an intercept course that was now 8 hours away. He had been awake for 22 hours. He did not appear to be awake for 22 hours. He appeared to be a man at the beginning of something, which was a quality he had never been entirely able to explain, and his crew had never been entirely able to replicate. Someone inside mapped an approach to the core, Riker said. Someone inside wants us to reach the core, Picard said. They could be leading us into a trap, Worf said. They could be, Picard agreed. They could also be 12,000 people who have been part of a machine for long enough that at least one of them has managed to think through the suppression and reach out through the only medium available to tell us how to free them. He looked at the map. I choose to take it as the latter until evidence suggests otherwise. Worf absorbed this with the respectful displeasure of a man who disagreed tactically but understood command philosophy. Duke had been standing at the back of the room again. He moved forward now, looking at the map with the specific focus of a man memorizing something he was about to need. The path avoids the densest integration zones, he said. Whoever drew this was thinking about collateral, emotional residue of a man who had been doing the terrible arithmetic for a very long time and had learned to live inside the calculation without letting it hollow him out. It was, she thought, one of the braver things she had encountered in her professional life. Not the certainty, the thing underneath it. I'll tell the captain, she said quietly, that you're ready. Duke picked up his sunglasses and put them back on. Tell him I've been ready, he said. I was just waiting for him to catch up. Data decoded the signal at 0317 hours. It was not a language. It was older than language, a pattern of bioelectric pulses structured in the universal mathematical framework that sentient minds across the galaxy had independently arrived at as the first vocabulary of contact, prime numbers, geometric sequences, the Fibonacci pattern, the intellectual equivalent of knocking on a wall. We are here. We think. We know you are there. But threaded through the mathematics, in the irregular spacing between pulses, was something that took data an additional 23 minutes to extract and another 7 to interpret, a spatial map, rough, degraded, assembled from whatever means the sender had available, from inside a state of near total neurological suppression, but a map nonetheless. It showed the interior of the vessel, and it showed a path. Picard looked at the decoded map for a long time without speaking. It was 0400 hours, and the bridge had the particular quality of deep shift operations, a skeleton crew running the essential systems, the lighting at 2/3, the ship moving at reduced warp on an intercept course that was now 8 hours away. He had been awake for 22 hours. He did not appear to be awake for 22 hours. He appeared to be a man at the beginning of something, which was a quality he had never been entirely able to explain, and his crew had never been entirely able to replicate. Someone inside mapped an approach to the core, Riker said. Someone inside wants us to reach the core, Picard said. They could be leading us into a trap, Worf said. They could be, Picard agreed. They could also be 12,000 people who have been part of a machine for long enough that at least one of them has managed to think through the suppression and reach out through the only medium available to tell us how to free them. He looked at the map. I choose to take it as the latter until evidence suggests otherwise. Worf absorbed this with the respectful displeasure of a man who disagreed tactically but understood command philosophy. Duke had been standing at the back of the room again. He moved forward now, looking at the map with the specific focus of a man memorizing something he was about to need. The path avoids the densest integration zones, he said. Whoever drew this was thinking about collateral. The transporter took them at 0547 hours. They materialized inside a conduit that was dark in the way that only total absence of external light sources could produce, not the darkness of night, which still contained ambient photons, but the darkness of inside, of enclosed, of something that had never expected light to be present and had made no accommodation for it. Their suit lights cut narrow channels through it. Around them, the walls of the conduit pulsed with a slow biological rhythm, not quite heartbeat, not quite breathing, something that incorporated both into a single motion that moved through the structure in long, unhurried waves. That's new, Duke said. The vessel is aware of us, Worf said, reading his suit sensors. Energy concentration in the surrounding structure has increased 0.3% since our arrival. 0.3% of a 4-kilometer ship is still a lot of ship, Duke said. Move. They moved. The path was exactly what the map had promised. Narrow, complex, requiring continuous navigation decisions. But navigable. Duke moved at the front, Worf behind, and to the left, the two of them establishing a rhythm within the first 100 meters that required no discussion, built from the shared grammar of people who had spent their lives moving through dangerous spaces and had learned the vocabulary of it bone deep. Twice in the first kilometer the path brought them close enough to integration zones that their sensors picked up individual biosignatures, human mostly, though data had noted several non-human species in the total count. Close enough to see, in the dim blue glow of their suit lights, the organic mechanical interfaces that lined the conduit walls. Close enough to understand, viscerally and completely, what the probe data had only suggested in abstract. Duke looked at them and kept moving. He filed it, the specific filing that soldiers and firefighters and emergency workers did. The cognitive act of acknowledging without processing, storing the weight of a thing until there was time to carry it properly. Worf looked at them and said nothing. His expression, visible through his helmet, was the expression of a Klingon warrior, confronting something that required a different kind of courage than combat, the courage of witnessing. The map updated as they moved. At the 2-kilometer mark, the path changed, the senders planned route was blocked by a structural shift that hadn't been present when the map was drawn, the vessel's internal architecture having reconfigured in the hours since. Dead end, Duke said, studying his wrist display. Not entirely. Data's voice came through the calm, degraded but present. I am tracking your position against the live sensor feed from the Enterprise. There is an alternate route, 40 meters back, junction on your left. It adds approximately 300 meters, but maintains biosignature avoidance. Copy, Duke said, and they moved back without discussion. The core announced itself before they reached it. A change in the quality of the darkness. The conduit walls brightening from biological pulse to active luminescence. The rhythm of the vessel's slow breathing accelerating towards something more urgent. The air in the suits registered increasing electromagnetic interference. Duke's suit lights began to fluctuate. They came out of the conduit into a space that was enormous. The core chamber was spherical, perhaps 200 meters across, and it glowed. Not uniformly. It glowed in patterns, in the shifting, organic complexity of something that was simultaneously machine and alive. At its center, suspended in a web of biological mechanical connection that extended to every wall, was the node itself, approximately the size of a shuttlecraft. Dense with pulsing energy, the origin point of everything the vessel was and did, and standing in the connections that surrounded it, arrayed throughout the web in a configuration that was both terrible and structured, were people, dozens of them in this chamber alone, integrated into the node's immediate network, their biosignatures bright on Duke's sensors, present, alive, minimal. Worf made a sound that was not a word. Low, controlled, but containing everything. Duke looked at the node. He looked at the people surrounding it. He looked at the chamber walls. reading the structural layout with the fast, comprehensive attention of someone who had learned to assess rooms for tactical purpose and for exit strategy simultaneously. Data, he said into the calm. Static. The interference was heavy now. Data. Clearer this time. LaForge must have boosted the relay. Here, Duke. Reading your position. You're at the node. I'm at the node. He looked at the web of connections. The people around it. If I disrupt the core. A burst of static. Then Crusher's voice, cutting through. The integration should release. The suppression field runs from the core outward. Disrupt the core, the field collapses. And they wake up, Duke said. And they wake up, Crusher confirmed. Inside a vessel that is also collapsing, you'll have static. Estimate 8 to 12 minutes before structural failure propagates through. Understood. Duke looked at Worf. 12 minutes to get everyone out. The Enterprise cannot transport 12,000 people in 12 minutes. Worf said. No, Duke said. But the core talk is out there too. He watched. Worf processed this, the calculation running fast behind the warrior's eyes. The math coming out the same way it always came out when you ran it honestly. I will coordinate the evacuation, Worf said. You go to the node. Don't wait for me, Duke said. I will not leave without you, Worf said. And it was not sentiment. It was the absolute statement of a Klingon warrior's code. The thing underneath all the professional friction of the past days. As fundamental and non-negotiable as gravity. Duke looked at him for 1 second. Okay, he said. Don't wait long. He crossed the chamber floor toward the node at a dead run. The vessel responded immediately, the web of connections tightening, energy concentrating, the biological mechanical walls contracting inward with the slow, massive deliberateness of something that had never needed to hurry before and was now deciding to. Duke moved through it the way he moved through everything. Forward, committed, already past the decision and into the execution, covering the distance between himself and the thing that needed hitting, with the focused purpose of a man who had been doing this his entire life and had not yet found the version of it that stopped him. He hit the node with everything he had. The chamber went white. The white lasted for seconds. Then it became sound, a deep, structural groan that moved through the vessel the way earthquakes moved through ground, not from any single point, but from everywhere simultaneously. The ship's integrated biology, responding to the disruption of its core the way a body responded to a stopped heart. The luminescence in the chamber walls flickered, steadied, flickered again, and began to die in sections, the patterns darkening from their outer edges inward like a fire going out. In the web of connections surrounding the node, things began to change. Duke had landed on his back, 6 meters from where he'd hit the node. His suit registering impacts he was already filing away for later consideration. He took stock the way he always took stock. Fast, systematic, everything at once. Suit integrity, holding. Weapons, present. Vision, returning. The node behind him was dark. Its pulsing energy signature collapsed into a residual glow that Data would later describe as consistent with catastrophic processing failure. He sat up. Around the chamber, in the web of biological mechanical connections. The people were waking up. Not all at once. It happened in sequence. The suppression field collapsing outward from the dead node. Each integrated individual's nervous system reasserting itself as the synthetic components lost their controlling current. It was not graceful. It was not peaceful. It was the specific, terrible process of consciousness, returning to people who had been somewhere else for a very long time. Their bodies remembering how to breathe of their own volition. Their minds beginning the long climb back through the dark. Duke was on his feet in seconds, moving to the nearest person, a woman middle-aged. Her integration points already beginning to disengage as the field died. Her eyes opening with the slow confusion of someone surfacing from a dream they couldn't remember having. Hey, Duke said, and his voice was different from his operational voice. Simpler, quieter, stripped of its usual forward momentum. You're okay. You're out. She looked at him. Through him, at first. Then at him. Where, she began. Doesn't matter yet. Can you move? A beat. She tried. I think. Good enough. He helped her up. Looked around the chamber at the dozens of others coming awake in the web. And beyond them at the conduit. Entrance where Worf had already established a position and was coordinating with the ferocious efficiency of a security Chief, who had converted all his complicated feelings about the last 4 days into pure operational focus. Core talk is responding. Worf reported, calm crackling but present. Commander Korveth has confirmed emergency transport capacity. Enterprise is handling outer ring evacuations. LaForge rerouted the transporter array to maximum throughput. A pause. They are remarkable, the engineers of this ship. Duke moved through the chamber, helping people to their feet, directing them toward Worf and the conduit, running the math in his head automatically. People per minute, minutes remaining. The structural, groaning around him increasing in frequency as the vessels. Integrated systems began losing coherence. Without their central processor. How many? He said to Worf as he deposited the third person at the conduit entrance. In this chamber, 62, Worf said. Vessel-wide, the transporter teams are working outward from the core. Crusher estimates 70% clearance in 8 minutes. 70% of 12,000 is still. I know, Worf said. He met Duke's eyes through their helmets. We work faster. They worked faster. What happened in the next 7 minutes? In that chamber would not make it into the official Enterprise log in full detail. Because official logs had standard formats and standard formats were not designed for the specific quality of what occurred, too. Men from completely different worlds, different centuries, different fundamental frameworks for what it meant to face impossible things. Working in absolute unison across a collapsing alien structure to move 62 barely conscious people through a conduit to a transporter. Point while the walls breathed. Their last around them. Duke carried 3 people simultaneously at one point, which Worf noted in his personal log with 3 words, stronger than reported. Worf held a collapsing section of conduit, wall opened by brute force for 90 seconds while Duke moved the last 7 people through, which Duke noted by saying nothing at all, which Worf understood as the highest available compliment. At 7 minutes and 40 seconds, Worf's suit sensors reported 0 biosignatures remaining in the core chamber. Clear, Duke said. Clear, Worf confirmed. They ran. The conduit was changing. Around them, the biological mechanical structure losing its slow, coherent rhythm. The walls contracting irregularly. Sections of the integrated architecture beginning to fail in cascading sequence as the vessels. Systems lost the organizing intelligence that had run them. It was not a clean collapse. It was the complex, non-linear failure of something that had never been designed to stop, that had run without interruption for decades, on the processed neural energy of thousands of people, that had no shutdown protocol, because shutdown had never been part of its operating parameters. Duke navigated it the way he navigated everything, forward, fast, reading the changes in real time and adjusting without pausing to think about adjusting. His body doing the work while his mind stayed 3 moves ahead. Behind him, Worf matched him stride for stride. The Klingons' combat training having prepared him for, among other things, moving at speed through structurally compromised spaces while ignoring the parts of his brain that were making reasonable suggestions about stopping. Data's voice came through at intervals, brief, precise, the anchor of the Enterprise's sensor picture guiding them through junctions where the map had become irrelevant, and instinct was insufficient, and only real-time data could thread the needle. Left at the next junction, Data said. The section ahead has already failed. Left. 40 meters, then the conduit opens. Into what was a secondary bay? Structural integrity. Holding at 60%. 40 meters. Bay. Transporter lock is marginal at your current depth. You need 15 more meters toward the outer hull. 15 meters. I have you, Data said, and the transporter took them. They materialized on the Enterprise in Transporter Room 2, with the specific gracelessness of a transportation conducted at the absolute edge of signal clarity, not the clean, vertical resolution of a standard beam, but the slightly chaotic reassembly of a signal that had been fighting interference every microsecond of its journey. Duke landed on one knee. Worf landed on both feet, which was purely Klingon stubbornness making itself manifest at the molecular level. LaForge was at the console. He looked at them with the expression of a man who had been watching sensor readouts for 8 minutes and was very glad to see 2 specific biosignatures appear on his pad. Welcome back, he said, and his voice had the specific quality of understatement deployed by engineers who dealt with fear by remaining useful. Duke stood, took stock, everything present. He looked at the transporter console. Display, the evacuation. Numbers updating in real time. The counters climbing as the Enterprise and Kortok continued their work on the vessel's outer sections. Numbers, he said. LaForge checked. 11,412 confirmed evacuated. Remaining signatures, he paused. Watching the feed, the count is dropping fast. Crusher's teams are on the medical decks. Korveth has 600 in Klingon medical bays. He looked up. We got them. Duke absorbed this. The math he'd been running for 8 minutes. The terrible, non-negotiable arithmetic of how many and how fast resolved itself into a number that was not 12,000 but was close enough that the difference could be addressed and not merely mourned. He walked to the wall and leaned against it and was still for a moment. Worf stood nearby. Neither of them spoke. They had moved together through something that had no clean name and required no immediate discussion, and they both understood that. After a moment, Worf said, "You fought well." Duke looked at him. "You held that wall open for 90 seconds. It required holding," Worf said simply. "Yeah." Duke looked at the ceiling. It did. On the main bridge, Picard stood at the view screen and watched the vessel. It was collapsing now, not explosively but gradually. Its 4-kilometer structure losing coherence section by section as the integrated systems failed without their core, the biological mechanical architecture that had consumed decades and thousands of lives slowly ceasing to be. It was, in its way, a peaceful dissolution, nothing like the violent ends Picard had witnessed in his career, nothing like the battle he had prepared for. It was more like something that had been running too long finally being allowed to stop. The last biosignature cleared the vessel at 11,907. 86 confirmed unrecoverable, integrated beyond the threshold. Crusher had identified their biological signatures already too degraded when the core fell. Picard held those 86 for a moment in the way he held every irretrievable loss, fully, without looking away, accepting the weight of them as the price of the thing that had been done and could not have been done differently. Then he turned to his bridge. "I'll stop," he said. "Begin coordination with Commander Korveth on medical distribution and survivor assessment. Get me Dr. Crusher's full report when available." He paused. "And tell Mr. Nukem and Lieutenant Worf." Another pause. Briefer. "Well done." The message reached transporter room 40 seconds later. Duke read it on LaForge's console display. He read it twice, which was not something he normally did with messages. Then he handed the pad back to Geordi and walked out of the transporter room into the corridor, moving in the direction of the medical decks. He spent the next 6 hours there. He did not announce himself. He did not explain his presence to the medical staff, who were too busy to ask and had learned in 4 days not to question where Duke Nukem appeared or why. He moved through the recovery bays, the Enterprises. Then, via a shuttle, the Kortoks, and he spoke to people. Not at length, not with particular eloquence, but he spoke to them in the specific way of someone who understood, from the inside, what it was to have been taken by something enormous and have survived the process. And people who had been inside the vessel for weeks or months or years heard something in that voice that the most carefully trained counselors on 2 ships couldn't quite replicate. At 1,400 hours he was sitting in the corridor outside Medical Bay 3 when Picard found him. The captain sat down beside him, not in a chair, on the corridor floor, with the unself-conscious practicality of a man who had long since stopped caring about dignified appearances when something more important was happening. They sat side by side against the wall, the ship humming around them, the distant sounds of medical activity providing the specific ambient noise of aftermath. 86, Duke said. "Yes," Picard said. "I ran the math 6 different ways." "So did I." Duke was quiet for a moment. There wasn't another answer. "No," Picard said. "There wasn't." He paused. "That doesn't make it lighter." "No," Duke agreed. "It doesn't." They sat together in the corridor of the Enterprise D, the 24th century ship and the 21st century soldier, in the specific shared silence of people who had learned to carry weight that didn't diminish and had found, in the carrying, something that might be called company. After a while, Picard said, "We still don't know how to get you home." "I know," Duke said. "Data is working on it. The dimensional rift residue we detected on your arrival. He believes there may be a method to reconstruct." "I heard," Duke said. "He briefed me this morning." A pause. "Could be a while." "It could," Picard agreed. "In the meantime," he stopped. Chose his next words with the care he gave to words that mattered. "In the meantime, this ship could use someone with your particular perspective on threat assessment." Duke looked at him. "Not a commission," Picard said. "Not a rank. Not a uniform. Not regulations that would require you to carry a weapon that only stuns." The corner of his mouth moved. "A consulting arrangement. Informal. Subject to ongoing mutual agreement." Duke looked at the corridor ceiling for a moment. Outside the ship, 11,821 people were alive who had not been free this morning. 86 were not. The math sat in him the way it always sat, permanently, without resolution, as it should. "Your ship," Duke said finally, "has a stun setting." "Yes," Picard said. "And a holodeck, which you will use responsibly. And a replicator that's getting better at real food. Ensign Shun in the kitchen has taken it as a personal project." Duke nodded slowly. He thought about Earth, 300 years behind him, currently in the middle of the exact kind of crisis that required exactly his particular skill set. He thought about the rift and Data's calculations, and the specific uncertainty of when. He thought about 12,000 people and 8 minutes in a Klingon holding a wall. "Consulting arrangement," he said. "Informal," Picard confirmed. "Mutual agreement." Duke stood, reaching his full height in the corridor, which required him to adjust slightly to avoid the overhead lighting fixture. A gesture that had become, in 4 days, oddly familiar to anyone who worked this deck. He looked down at the captain, who looked back up at him with the expression of a man who had made stranger arrangements and found them worthwhile. "Don't expect me to stop carrying the Devastator," Duke said. "I wouldn't dream of it," said Picard. Duke extended his hand. Picard took it. Somewhere on the bridge, Data added a new file to his ongoing research project. Nukem. Duke. Status. Ongoing. And updated the projected timeline with a quiet, functional satisfaction that he did not entirely try to analyze. In his quarters on Deck 7, Worf sat down to write his daily log and stared at the entry for today for a long time before writing. Simply, "He is acceptable." Coming from Worf, everyone who eventually read it agreed this was extraordinary. And in the corridor outside Medical Bay 3, Duke Nukem stood in the 24th century and listened to the ship around him. Its hum, its life, its 11,000 passengers and crew going about the business of being human and Klingon and android and Betazoid in the specific, complicated, hopeful way that Picard's Federation had decided was worth defending, and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. He filed it. He'd process it later. Right now, there were people who needed checking on. He went back into the medical bay. The USS Enterprise D logged stardate 47,634.2 as the date of the vessel incident. The recovery of 11,821 individuals from an unknown harvesting craft of non-Federation origin, accomplished through joint operation with the IKS Kortok and the unconventional tactical contributions of a temporal anomaly from the 21st century. The official record was precise, thorough, and captured almost none of what had actually occurred. What it could not capture was the way 11,000 people woke up in Starfleet medical bays and heard a voice that sounded like it had never considered the possibility of giving up. It could not capture Worf's log entry, which circulated through the ship with the speed of things that are brief and true. It could not capture Data's ongoing file, growing daily, becoming something that the android privately considered one of his most significant research projects. The rift that had brought Duke Nukem to the 24th century remained a problem without a clean solution. Data worked it. LawForge consulted. Time passed in the way it passed on starships, purposefully, at warp, toward whatever came next. Whatever came next, the Enterprise was carrying something new in its complement now. A man from 3 centuries back who had spent his life moving toward the things that scared him, in a universe that